Zachary is an associate professor of musicology and ethnomusicology in the School of Music and Dance at the University of Oregon. He is a faculty affiliate in UO's Center for Translational Neuroscience. His interests lie in popular music, timbre, and music cognition. Prior to his appointment at UO, Wallmark served on the music faculty at Southern Methodist University, come on in, where he also held a courtesy appointment in psychology. He has taught undergraduate and graduate courses on American popular music, history and analysis, music and emotion, film music, hip-hop, timbre, music and politics, and opera, among other topics. Working at the intersection of the cognitive sciences and musicology, Wallmark's research seeks to account for the role of music, timbre, and am I pronouncing that correctly?
You are pronouncing it. Congratulations on that.
That's good. It's a word I only say in Spanish, and so I was like, I don't know what to say.
Stamp,
right? In emotional response, aesthetic judgment, and music sociology, particularly in the context of post-1945 American popular music. His book, Nothing But Noise, Timbre and Musical Meaning at the Edge, which came out with Oxford in 2022, explores the slippery psychoacoustic and social fault lines separating perceptions of musical timbre from noise, with reception case studies drawn from free jazz, extreme heavy metal, otherwise known as noise, but convince me, and traditional Japanese music. Wallmark's work has been published in both musicological and scientific journals, including Emotion, Ethnomusicology Review, Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience, Journal of the American Musicological Society, Music Perception and Music Science, Music Theory Online, Psychology of Music, and Psychomusicology. He's also co-editor with Robert Fink and Melinda Latour of the award-winning volume, The Relentless Pursuit of Tone, Timbre in Popular Music, which came out with Oxford in 2018. As a 24-25 Oregon Humanities Center Research Fellow, Wallmark has been working on a project, which I've already mentioned, A Nation of Instruments, How 9 Sounds Shaped America. He shares his work in progress with us today. As I said, the first in our weekly works in progress or books in print talks. And so thank you for going first.
Thank you very much for having me, Leah. I appreciate all of you taking some time out from your busy weeks to join us today for this talk. I want to really lean into this in progress part of because we are now 3 weeks into this project officially. Accordingly, what I'm going to be presenting today is not a super polished paper. Okay, I have a very rough script and some notes that I'll be kind of jumping into. I'll do a little reading, and then we'll make it a bit more free form. We can have some conversation about this. It's going to be pretty informal and conversational today, which makes sense because I'm going to be focusing on the banjo. And something feels weird about doing the banjo in a very formal way. So I'm going to be focusing on the banjo. The aim today is to provide, first of all, a very general overview of this project as a whole. Then we'll zone in on the banjo. Okay. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to listen and to discuss, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. If there's time left over at the end, then I can do kind of a speed dating version of all the other instruments. We can just jump into the other 8, and I'll give you a 4-sentence version of why I think that instrument is really cool. Okay? That's the plan. In the late 19th century, the banjo, an instrument long associated with Africa, slavery, and things like this, was blowing up in white America. A critic in 1888 fumed about this newfound popularity. How in the name of common sense, an instrument with such an unmusical quality of tone intended for the weird and wild songs and dances of the uncultivated Negro race could have ever taken hold on people who are supposed to be cultured, that is, white people, is a mystery. Over the next few decades, the mystery deepened. By the time of the first hillbilly records of the 1920s, what observers called the half-barbaric twang and percussive syncopation of the banjo had largely transformed into a sonic stereotype of the weird, wild ways of uncultivated whites, a connection that has endured to the present. How and why did the meaning of the banjo shift when it did? The study of musical instruments, or organology, has long been premised on 19th century taxonomical and evolutionary theories. Conceptualized this way, instruments are viewed as passive markers of cultural development. To remedy these ethnocentric disciplinary foundations, a new critical organology has been proposed by recent scholars that treats the materiality, the degrees of agency, the uses, and the social values of instruments as the basis for historical inquiry. So traditional organology basically asks, what is this instrument? Let's classify this instrument. Critical organology follows and says, what has this instrument meant? To whom? Why? As we'll see with the banjo example today, the sounds, techniques, and associative histories of musical instruments can reveal hotly contested negotiations over meaning and power in society. We're long overdue for a critical examination of the core instruments of American popular music. U.S. popular music history has been elegantly refracted through several scholarly prisms, including genre history, music sociology, cultural history, and biography. However, the material substrates of music making, the instruments themselves, are typically under-theorized. Music scholars tend, quite understandably, to focus on the music, songs, artists, cultural networks, things like this, without fully accounting for the tools, technologies, techniques, and timbres that constitute it. Further, although writers have detailed the social lives of individual instruments, there's a small library of books on the banjo alone, there is to date no work synthesizing the historical trajectories of multiple instruments into a unifying theoretical framework and narrative. Without adequately grappling with the instruments of American music through a critical musicological lens, we're missing a consequential and fascinating part of the story of American music and culture. My Oregon Humanities Center faculty fellowship supports research and development on this book, which I'm tentatively calling A Nation of Instruments. This is a riff off of A Nation of Immigrants, right? There we go. Sorry about that. So this is a public humanities project. I'm intending this for a broad readership. I'm intending to publish this with the trade press with a lot of online materials, playlists, and visuals, that kind of thing. The book takes the central position that instruments are not just neutral objects to make music with, but physical repositories of cultural knowledge and values. Instrumental sound and playing technique are historically and socially situated. Accordingly, the structures, sound palettes, and techniques of the most iconic and controversial instruments in American music can act as a window into the social processes that endow them with meaning. Instrumental lineages are thus a material and audible record of shifting power dynamics and social change. Many of the surprising stories in my project, for instance, show a path of instrumental indigenization, where the physical forms, sounds, and symbolisms of existing instruments are remolded to fit new contexts and purposes. In chronicling the advent, adoption, adaptation, absorption, and abandonment of different sounds to meet the expressive needs of changing communities at different times, my project charts the tensely negotiated social grounds on which America fashions itself sonically. Doing so, the project stands to make a significant contribution to the public discourse on the relation between music making and social structure in the U.S. So to tell this story, I'm going to be focusing on these nine instruments and the role they've played. I would argue a very outsized role in American and global vernacular music making. Now, these aren't necessarily the most ubiquitous instruments. This list would certainly include the piano and the acoustic guitar, but they are, I argue, uniquely positioned to tell the story of American culture. I combined several methods in this project, including perspectives from musicology, this is my home discipline, critical organology, sound studies, reception history, science and technology studies, and new materialism scholarship to show how instruments are shaped by social forces, and conversely, and importantly, how they've played an active role in molding the cultural heritage of the nation, with a focus on the intersection of race, class, and gender. To tell the story of these instruments in American life, I'm going to introduce a simple 4-point framework for reading the social life or the cultural biography of instruments. And again, this project is intended for a broad readership. It's not a scholarly project. And they all happen to start with the letter S, so we can be kind of cute about it and call this the 4S system. We can think about instruments as stuff, as self, as sound, and as symbol. What do I mean by this? Okay, these are all overlapping categories. They're all subsumed under an overarching, another S concept, which is these are all social. These are all social processes. So let me say a bit about each of these approaches. First, instruments are made up of stuff, right? They're physical, they're material. I can grab onto an instrument, okay? They're technologies. They're the product of natural materials transformed through human labor and knowledge. In recent times, these objects are often commodities, products intended for exchange in a broader capitalist marketplace of musical instruments and sounds. An instrument is thus a reflection of an often quite complex series of economic and cultural negotiations with ecological impacts. For example, take the piano, whose keys historically were made from ivory. In the mid-19th century, the rise of demand for pianos led American manufacturers to purchase huge amounts of ivory from Africa, which led to the decimation of elephant populations. So telling the story of an instrument is engaging with its physical properties, forms, technologies, and raw materials, what this material disposition tells us about how and why it's endowed with value, and the consequences, importantly, of its materiality. An instrument is also an interface that allows the player to physically interact with it. This is an important part of the design. An important part of the design, then, consists in the way it couples with the player's body. There's a cultural politics to instrumental interfaces. So staying with this piano example, for instance, at the same time that this ivory market was skyrocketing due to middle-class popularity of pianos and other keyboard instruments, the piano keyboard itself served as the model for the typewriter, which was originally, in fact, referred to as the piano type. Since the primary market for pianos in the Victorian era were women, specifically young middle-class women who studied the piano largely in domestic spaces, the digital, that is the hand-finger demands of the new technology, honed through years of practice at the piano interface, made this population ideal candidates for skilled, though low-paying, secretarial work, thus starkly gendering this labor field for many generations to come. A cultural biography of the piano would have to consider these and many other material conditions as intrinsic to the impact of the instrument on American life. Additionally, as material objects, instruments are visual as well as sonic. Their design aesthetics are often dictated as much, if not sometimes more, than by how they look, and crucially, how they make the performer and the ensemble look. For example, take the accordion. As the composer and the accordionist William Schimmel put it, recalling his initial views of the instrument in the 1950s and 60s, quote, "The accordion couldn't take the place of the Fender Stratocaster, which was thin, electric, and phallic. We wanted to be thin back then. Rock and roll was being thin. Vaudeville with the accordion on was being fat. We wanted to be Americans first. You put on an accordion and you show your ethnicity back in 1956. And the Stratocaster had all those American qualities. A lot of it is visual, right? This relates to my next major perspective. Instruments aren't simply material objects, like a doorknob or a toaster. By design and by definition, they are meant to share something of a player's subjectivity by sounding out their ideas, their emotions, their expressive goals, and their unique personality. In short, instruments are a kind of technologically mediated voice, a sonic manifestation of self. The merging of stuff and self is most clear to see at the interfaces, where hands, fingers, mouths, and other body parts interact with the instrument. This bond can be very intimate. Musicians routinely talk about their instrument as an extension of their body and their will, and instruments are often anthropomorphized. For wind instruments, the player is literally animating this thing with their breath. Hands and fingers, which are involved in most instrumental interfaces, are themselves instruments for doing things in the world, for actively manipulating our environment. Instrumental technique, then, is the set of learned bodily strategies and motor scripts that a player activates to transform an inert thing into a reflection of some version of themselves, somewhat akin to a mask or a ventriloquist dummy. Now, this self-presentation need not always be truthful in its reflection of myself. A player can perform other selves. We can deceive. But it's the very performative nature of selfhood and identity that I want to emphasize here, as embodied in a player's relationship with an instrument. We perform sonic versions of ourselves for many reasons. Maybe we wish to show an identification with a certain group. Maybe we want to demonstrate how cool or how sexy we are. Maybe we want to align ourselves with a particular kind of past or a particular future. In short, instruments help us position ourselves within a social field. Next, obviously, instruments produce sound. The material disposition of an instrument and the playing techniques applied to the player produce a range of tones, or timbre, this hard-to-pronounce word, specific to each instrument. We can all tell the difference between the sound of a banjo and a fiddle because of their starkly differing timbral profiles. Each instrument has its own identifiable sound, just like every individual has a different voice or a different fingerprint. So just to very quickly illustrate this, here's a clip showing the timbral differences of a few instruments. And the visualization technique I'm using here is called a spectrograph. So this is representing time on the x-axis and strength in various harmonic partials on the y-axis. if it's in here. This harpsichord is a little brighter, more high energy. So each instrument has a different sound. We can graph it. This is actually very easy to quantify. The sitar has most of its energy way up high, right? And so on and so forth. So instruments are physical stuff that perform the self by way of differentiated sonic profiles. Clearly, the specific timbral palette afforded by an instrument, then, is not coincidental to that instrument's uses, adoption, popularity, and so on. Players and communities use an instrument because of what it offers them expressively. The task in any thick description of instrumental sound, then, is to ask what an instrument sounds like in terms of its acoustic makeup, but more importantly, to theorize why and how different musical communities have adopted it as their voice in varying historical and cultural contexts. For example, when discussing the sound of the electric guitar, this line of inquiry might examine why and how distortion, electric guitar distortion, the result of pushing old tube amplifiers past their operating capacity, went from a sign of failure and abusing your gear to a sonic icon of rock music and everything socially that this entails. And I spent a little bit of time in my first book kind of building out a method for how to do a social analysis of timbre. I'm basically just going to import that model directly over into this project. So to recap, instruments are material stuff, a projection of self, and a way to make specific sounds. So far, so good. The final perspective synthesizes the other three to interrogate how instruments come to be meaningful, how they symbolize or reference aspects of social life outside of music per se. And we're going to see a little bit how this works in the banjo case study that's going to be most of this talk. The basic idea here is that a sound made by an instrument is never a neutral event that occurs in a social vacuum. It has a story, it has a past, a web of associations, both collective and personal. To illustrate this, I want to do a quick little experiment right now. I'm going to play a really short clip of music. Now listen carefully. This is less than half a second. This is extremely short, okay? There's no information there's no lyrics, anything like this. I want us to focus in on what we hear in this blip of sound. Okay, what can we parse from this? Ready? Anybody? Could we parse anything at all from that? That was 400 milliseconds, by the way. Yeah.
It sounded like it was recorded a while ago.
Interesting. So we've got a sense of the historicity of this thing. Okay, it doesn't sound modern. Good.
It went over the radio.
It sounds like it went over the radio, so maybe there's a crackliness or something to it. We're able to glean that quickly.
Or coming out of a smaller speaker, like an organ speaker. To me, it sounds like an organ. But
Oh, interesting. Maybe something like lower fidelity, smaller,
Yeah,
it's
small.
not stereo. Okay. We can poke and prod at something like this for a while. This is really just to illustrate. This, in fact, was the prominent instrument is a steel guitar. Okay. So the sound may signal the instrument. Okay. It may also signal the player. It can signal a kind of player. It can signal a whole genre. This actually comes from a Hank Williams record. Here, mid-century, so it signals a history. Mid-century country music, maybe. Genres themselves are social categories masquerading as musical ones. The sound might make us think of country music. It might make us think of country music fans or a particular stereotype we might have about fans. It might make us think of a whole region that's associated with this music, and on and on and on. So one blip of instrumental sound can conjure a world of social relations, and do so quite quickly, often in ways that we're not really consciously aware of. One of the goals of this project is to ask in an accessible way what instruments have meant in American cultural and social history, and to whom. And I selected these 9 instruments to kind of tell that story. Okay, so I've laid out a few of the basic premises of the project, but this is all pretty abstract at this point. So to make things a bit more concrete, I want to spend basically all the rest of my time on just one of these instruments, the banjo. So I'm going to go totally off script at this point. I have some notes, but this is where we can get a little bit looser with things. So I'm kind of thinking about the banjo, the history of the banjo in the United States as 4 major eras. These are all very approximate date ranges, but the first is what I'm going to call the first African instrument. The second is the banjo and minstrelsy, and then what what I'm calling a folk versus modern battle over the meaning of the timbre. This is when things get really hot for the instrument of the banjo. And then a kind of moment of revivalism. So I'm going to try to document in 20 minutes how these pieces fit together. This is going to be kind of quick. I'm going to play a little bit. We can listen if we have time. So the banjo has been called an instrument without a birth certificate. And that's because we really have very murky understanding of where this instrument comes from. What we know for a fact, however, is that it is African derived. Okay, there's no evidence that it actually came over through the Middle Passage in its full form. But what we see is that throughout the Caribbean and the southern states of the United States in the 17th century, you start to see reference of this instrument. And there's all kinds of long neck lutes in West African. It's actually a quite ubiquitous instrument across West Africa, being performed by enslaved people. So we know there's West African origins, but not specific to any particular ethnic group or tradition. This was an instrument very much forged by the experience of the Middle Passage and of chattel slavery. These are all the names it's gone by over the years. Okay, this is a shapeshifter of an instrument. It's appeared as the merriwang in Jamaica, the strum in Suriname, every possible version of banjo, banjier, banza. Okay, it really was kind of linguistically all over the map. Folks think it comes from a region of Africa, Mbanza, in what's now Congo. Several Caribbean Creole languages have a word for dance, which is baya, banya, bandi, which could have come from that. It could have come from the Spanish dance, bailar. It could have come from the French bonjour. Okay, these are all speculative. We don't know. We don't know where this came from. This is why, in some ways, and I think this is really perceptive, the historian Laurent Dubois calls the banjo the first African instrument. He says the banjo offered something vital to those on the plantation. It was recognizably African, an instrument capable of offering familiar melodies and rhythms and timbres, but without being clearly derived from the traditions of any specific African ethnicity. And he says it was the first African instrument. Obviously, this wasn't the first instrument in Africa. But what he's chronicling is the advent of a particular kind of emerging ethos of what African identity is, okay? That really emerges in the Caribbean and emerges in a plantation context where people from wholly dissimilar ethnic groups are put together. The rate of turnover, the rate of new arrivals was intense in the 17th century. At any given time, from some of the first documented plantations around the 1600s, 1610, 1620 in the Caribbean, well over 50% of all people were new arrivals from Africa. Many of them spoke different languages. They did not know how to come together. The banjo offered this. It was a coalition-building instrument. Okay. So what makes a banjo? This is actually the earliest sketch of a banjo in existence from a British man who journeyed to Jamaica in the 1690s. He wrote about it in 1707. You have something stretched, a skin that is stretched over a gourd or a calabash. Okay, you have a couple strings over it. You also notice, well, these are just a couple strings. But when we look at the first, this is the earliest surviving banjo. Okay, from around 1770, it was called the Creole Banya. You have a couple strings that are long, and then you have in the middle a space for a short string. Okay, this is a drone. It's higher. Okay. Note as well, this was made by an enslaved person. Look at the degree of craftsmanship of this instrument. It is exceptional. Okay, this was clearly a highly skilled word worker who made this. We don't know who made this. We don't have any record of that. But this was far from a primitive instrument, as many people talked about the banjo in the early years. One of the first sort of iconic images representing the banjo, and this is a striking image because it's devoid of kind of the stereotypes, the ethnic stereotypes that you see in many artistic representations of slave life at this time, was from around 1785. And we see somebody picking on something that again has our short string here, okay, calabash or gourd, and then some animal skin stretched across the top. Okay. A couple accounts. How are we doing? Okay. I'll be quick. These are a couple early accounts of the banjo. Thomas Jefferson wrote about it in 1782, for instance. This idea of a rude guitar. References to it being wild, the sound being primitive, wild, barbaric, twangy, savage, all of these sounds. But I included this last one here because we're starting to see a wild and common shift in perception. In the 18th century, a lot of comments were just, oh, these people are making this weird noise on this instrument. In the early 19th century, more and more white observers are starting to speak about the banjo with some sympathy. Okay? They're even inviting black banjo players to play for parties, house parties. Okay, we have the first evidence of enslaved banjo players playing for white house parties from the tail end of the 18th century. Okay, oftentimes with the fiddle. Okay, so there was something about this sound that some white people were really fascinated by. Okay, I want to spend a second on technique here. So when we're talking about the old banjo, antebellum banjo, we're always talking about a particular technique that's known in old-time banjo circles now as claw hammer banjo or frailing. Okay, we can also call this downstroke technique or striking. The first historical record to this technique, and this technique is significant because this is the original African technique. Okay, comes from the 1690s. This is a description by Jean-Baptiste Labat in Martinique. He ends this thing by saying they play by pinching and beating the strings. Okay, what he's referring here is doing this kind of thing. Okay, so this technique sounds a little bit like this. This song is not from this era. This song I'm going to play is called Cripple Creek. It's from the middle of the 19th century. Okay, oftentimes played using claw hammer techniques. So let me try to just give you a sense of what this sounds like. You'll notice that it's very percussive. There's a degree of percussive rhythmic density to this manner of playing. You'll notice that I'm going to be doing some slides. Okay, this is because the original gourd banjos did not have frets. Okay, so the sound of a slide persisted as an enduring performance practice in basically all banjo. Okay, you don't see a lot of fast, well, you can see finger work, but you also oftentimes see moving around like this on the instrument. So this is the basic claw hammer technique. Note that my thumb is accenting on offbeats, so there's a syncopation built into this style. This kind of gesture is common in claw hammer. There's a density to the rhythmic information in this sound. Okay, and this is a really fascinating sort of story where the original way that white Americans played the banjo is directly derived from these original African practices. This is the great banjo player Rhiannon Giddens playing an actual gourd banjo. So this is a little bit more like what it would actually sound like. A lot lower too. Okay, the banjo at this time was significantly lower than a modern instrument. Check out all those slides. Banjo and fiddle combination was the pop band of the 19th century. Okay, that combination was essential. It was essential in minstrelsy too. Okay, this really codifies this combination of the banjo and the fiddle. Now, black-based minstrelsy is a super uncomfortable thing to discuss, but its significance both for the banjo and American culture writ large are really profound. This was America's first homegrown popular culture and our first major global export. Though the demeaning representation of black people by whites is blatantly racist by today's standards, there was a lot more at work in minstrelsy than simple mockery. The musicologist Eric Lott calls this a dynamic nexus of love and theft. Saidia Hartman less charitably calls it terror and entertainment. It's a huge topic, and I'm not going to get into this at all right now. But the basic gist is that white people in antebellum America, especially Irish immigrants, were fascinated by the musical culture of enslaved blacks and sought to commodify it for a national and international audience. Key to this fascination was the banjo. Okay, the fiddle was well known to Irish immigrants. It was the banjo that was the novelty that got them really fascinated. And in fact, not coincidentally, the first white banjoist who was verified by the historical record as the first white person to touch this instrument and play it is also one of the first blackface minstrels, a guy named Joel Sweeney, who learned how to play the banjo by apprenticing with enslaved musicians on a neighbor's farm in the 1810s and the 1820s. So how did minstrelsy change the banjo? Okay, so you had all these professional minstrels running around. They needed sturdy, loud instruments. The gourd banjo just wouldn't cut it. It didn't penetrate, and they broke all the time. Okay, so people like Sweeney and others in the 1840s and 50s started to work with, oftentimes wood makers, cabinet makers, things like this, to change the structure of the instrument. They added a low melody string. So most banjos just consisted of these four strings. Sweeney added this low one. So now I can do things like this, okay? They added a wood rim. This used to be cheese boxes were really common. Someone would just take an old cheese box from factory-made cheese and just use that. This is a big deal at this period. A drum maker in Baltimore named Boucher said, "We make drums. This is essentially a drum with strings. Why don't we just take a drum?" And so they came up with the idea of essentially tightening a membrane over the instrument, a skin, in an identical technology to a drum, to a military drum. Okay, this is way louder than the earlier ones. It's way more stable. The instrument stays in tune. This becomes the absolute norm. Black and white musicians adopt this new technology. The gourd banjo goes away at this point, largely. Okay. There's also a kind of standardization here that occurs and a commodification of this instrument due to the mega popularity of minstrel groups. People wanted to get their hands on this exotic new instrument, okay? The historical record shows that it was very difficult to find an instrument in the up until about the time of the Civil War, slightly before the Civil War, okay? Joel Walker Sweeney would hide his instrument. He would hide his technique. Right after a gig, he would actually lock it up because he didn't want anybody seeing his instrument. Okay? Most makers at this time would create a handful of instruments in their life. This is a very artisanal model of instrument making. It wasn't until minstrelsy blew up and industrialization took over, water-powered machines, steam-powered machines, that these could go into factory production. And by the 1880s, 1890s, you were getting them in catalogs for $1.50. Okay? So this created a banjo craze. Okay, you can get one for cheap. The sound of this, there's no sound recordings, obviously, from the minstrel era, and historical recreations are, for very obvious reasons, problematic. But we all know minstrel songs. O Susanna is a minstrel song. Dixie, Swanee River, Old Folks at Home, Turkey in the Straw. These are all minstrel songs that most people learn today in this country as folk songs. Right? These are actually minstrel songs. But there's this kind of Afro-Celtic synthesis going on here, characterized by a two-way stream of imitation, a marriage of the Irish folk dancing fiddle with the New World black banjo. Some of the old, some of the new. Okay, and I should point out with the clawhammer earlier, I should have pointed out that this. What do you think the social context of this sort of sound was? What's this meant to do? It's dance music. Banjo players, fiddlers were the DJs of 19th century American culture. This was meant to dance to. Okay? So the meaning of the banjo in this period of minstrelsy connoted to Northern Americans, again, this very much is a romanticized imaginary image of the old plantation or the old South for white consumers, produced mainly by Northerners for Northern audiences. Okay? This next era, how am I doing? Okay. And please jump in if you have any questions. so I don't just run through all the time talking and playing.
Well, I have one very
John.
elementary question.
Please.
You focused on the banjo, but I have a lot of friends who play the ukulele. So does that have a different heritage?
Very different and
Yeah.
fascinating story with that too, because that comes from the Hawaiian music craze of the 1900s, 19-teens. Okay, this was the time that Hawaiian troops, minstrelsy was falling apart at this point. Minstrelsy seemed really old-fashioned in the 1910s and the early century. But Hawaiian musicians started in some ways filling the same kind of niche as minstrelsy. Touring Hawaiian shows were all over. There's records of these Hawaiian groups performing all over the United States. The slide guitar is a technique that comes from the Hawaiians in this moment of encounter. That is playing guitar with a bar. The ukulele is another instrument that enters into widestream awareness during this time period as well. This comes immediately on the heels of the annexation of Hawaii in 1893. A lot of Hawaiian musicians were essentially refugees. Okay, they were fleeing their homeland, arriving on the west coast of the U.S., big population in the Bay Area, Los Angeles, and Seattle. Those were the big populations. And they brought these Hawaiian ways of playing with them. The ukulele itself comes from a Portuguese model that Portuguese sailors at the earliest part of the 19th century brought to the islands. So it's its own fascinating story. Yeah.
Is striking like an African technique, or is that just like, does it originate from there?
Oh, the striking technique?
Yeah.
It does.
Okay.
It does. And in fact, there are a number of instruments today. The akonting, for instance, the ngoni, a couple instruments from various West African groups play in that way. So I talked to an ethnomusicologist once who did field work, and he's a banjo player, and picked up one of the akonting and started to basically just frail on it. And they said, "How do you know how to play this instrument?" But he had never touched it. It was just using clawhammer technique. So we know for a fact, there's no historical dispute, that technique is African derived. Okay, the instrument is African derived. Minstrels use that technique. Okay, minstrels learn this technique from the plantations and from freed blacks in the north. Okay, there's also a lot of historical record of recent Irish Americans right around the time of the Revolutionary War in the Tidewater region, directly learning with slave populations. These are indentured servants. Okay, so there was this exchange of Irish fiddling, Irish dance forms with African Americans, and then incorporation of more syncopated forms of clawhammer banjo and other techniques to the Irish Americans at that time. So this whole folk versus modern distinction here, which I'm characterizing as the third stage, is where the banjo really becomes what the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai calls a tournament of values. Two starkly opposing claims on the instrument emerged towards the tail end of the 19th century. One perspective sees it as this folk instrument, okay, played to a limited extent by rural blacks, but more and more as the cultural heritage of rural whites from Appalachia, a tradition embodied by hillbilly musicians such as Roscoe Holcomb, Bascom Lamar Lunsford, and Uncle Dave Macon, who was with the Grand Ole Opry for a number of years. And now I'm putting this word folk in these obnoxious scare quotes right now because the ideology of folklore began exerting a strong influence on American popular culture around this time. As scholars have argued, early folklorists embraced a view of the folk as primitive, pure, cut off from modernity, charmingly backwards, and white. The first generation of these white rural folk musicians often leaned into these stereotypes for obvious reasons, because authenticity sells. So here's a quick example. This is Roscoe Holcomb. Okay. There we go. So people continued to play clawhammer or stroking, but this is a different technique here. We'll get to in a second.
I'm going back to the swamp.
Okay, so right around the same time, contrastingly, the banjo was embraced by some as a modern instrument. Okay, some folks advocated strongly for its elevation, and this was their words, into a respectable parlor instrument akin to a guitar or a piano, which involved shedding its old African and minstrel associations in favor of a European classical music model. Banjo clubs proliferated around the country around the 1890s. to spread the middle-class virtues of the banjo. And the scientific banjo boom led to a series of rapid changes in instrument design. The scientific banjo boom was a term by a banjo manufacturer named Stephen Stewart. Okay. But also around the same time, musicians featuring this newly modernized banjo features this new instrument in some of the most innovative, controversial black genres of the day, ragtime and jazz. In time, however, the parlor banjo, or the more classical middle-class banjo, kind of disappeared, and black musicians, wary of the banjo's minstrel past, pushed by the industry into recording only guitar-driven blues, and eclipsed by the drums and the guitar in jazz, largely abandoned this instrument. By the 1930s, the banjo was fairly generally associated with southern mountain whites, and this association remains pretty common today. So this is an example of some ragtime banjo. This is 1911. Okay. Not clawhammer. Yeah, Ulrike.
I had a question about the banjo and the voice. So here in this example, it sounded almost like the banjo was the
Lead
melody.
instrument. Mm-hmm.
And before there was this short example of the high male voice with the banjo.
Mm-hmm.
But in the original form, was there any singing along with it by the banjo player or not? And if, in what language and what sort of texts?
Hugely complex question that varies a lot by context. People definitely sang with the banjo.
Mm-hmm.
The minstrels sang with the banjo. However, that particular style is so dense that part of this modernization of the banjo, and it has to do with this particular technique, which was meant to, people said, now you can sing along with this because we've made this, we've modernized the technique, we've made it cleaner. These recordings, what you just heard, this vocal line was performed in this new technique. This is the upstroke or picking technique, which you start to see popularized right after the Civil War. Okay, so to play banjo in 1830 meant you were playing clawhammer. After the 1830s, these reformists, these people wanting to modernize the instrument, said, let's play it like a guitar. Let's pluck it. Okay, that gives you more flexibility. So doing the same tune, Cripple Creek, with they also added finger picks. So when we talk about the modernization of the instrument, really what this entails with the banjo is adding ever more layers of metal on top of things. Okay, we have a metal tone ring. Soon a metal resonator was added behind this. This is an open back banjo. Okay, this is a very old school, old style banjo. Makers in the 1860s, 70s started adding a metal reflecting plate behind it to make the sound project even more. People started using metal finger picks, metal strings. Okay, this is an industrial system of metallic music making. This is what Stevens referred to as the scientific boom in banjo making, was essentially metallicizing it to make the sound brighter, more brilliant, and louder. Okay, so this technique, as you just heard, allows you to pick out individual notes really clearly. It's meant for arpeggiation. Now I'm doing a technique right here called the roll. And this is probably something that you associate a lot with bluegrass, a lot of early music like this. This essentially is taking the fingers and dividing a string of eighth note arpeggio in groups of 3 and 2. Why 3 and 2? Why 3s and 2s here? Any ideas? This is actually a stupid trick question because we have three fingers. We have 3 fingers. We can't do 4. We can't do groups of 4. Okay, this poses a problem, but a really rich one for music that are in duple meter. Okay, because we have 8 eighth notes to work with, but we have 3 for the finger. What this means is there's groupings of 3, 3, 3. Can everybody just clap for me? You know, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now clap 2 against this 3. Now, so this would be a very basic roll. All rolls are more elaborated than that. They're usually 3-3-2, 3-2-3, or 2-3-3. So an example of 3-2-3 might be, if we can all count, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2. Clap. 3, 1-2-3, 1-2, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2. Okay. How about 3-2-3? That would be like 1-2-3, 1-2, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2-3. We do that. 1-2-3, 1-2, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 2. Okay, good. And there's other we could also do. This 1-2, 1-2-3, 1-2-3. Okay, so why am I getting into the weeds here? Because this sort of syncopation is what is happening in ragtime. Okay, this polyrhythmic way of playing is a distinctly African American heritage. Okay, heavily influenced by Afro-Caribbean rhythms. This is where the banjo becomes the drum set of string band music, the propulsion that drives bluegrass and other related styles ahead. This is Earl Scruggs, who kind of perfected the three-finger banjo roll technique. That's what we think of as the banjo now. There's a lot of this kind of thing, right? Okay. So now we have this competing set of techniques. We have claw hammer, but now we have this modern up-picking technique, which comes out of the world of classical music. Guitar style is what they called it in the late 19th century, but is picked up by players across the spectrum. Okay, a different kind of musical rhythmic heritage is encoded in this technique. Okay, the other technique is very much about dancing and rhythmic density. This is about polymetric syncopation, which is perfectly aligned with the Jazz Age. And in fact, Scott Joplin, piano innovator of ragtime, his father was a professional banjo player. And this was the musical vocabulary of ragtime music in the 1890s and 1900s. Okay, so.
And Zach, I just wanted to mention.
Please.
So it's 10 minutes to, and I know that people are going to have questions, so if we could ask you to take maybe 2 more minutes. And then
Yeah, I'll make this super fast. So the final phase here is the revival. And this is where folks like Pete Seeger get their hands on the instrument. And this is maybe probably the most unexpected part of this story, because with the Almanac Singers, the Weavers, the banjo is rebranded as an instrument of protest and rebellion, an instrument of the counterculture, forging communion with unions, young people, socialists, civil rights workers, anti-war activists, and down the spectrum here. So this is a moment where the meaning becomes sharply bifurcated. Banjo is both this rural, southern, white, conservative instrument and an urban, northern, progressive instrument, and we continue to live in this tension. So just to wrap things up, the banjo today contains multitudes. It remains this potent symbol of regional pride for mountain folks, has retained its associations with Appalachia in the eyes of many outside the region, both through positive and negative stereotypes. Consistent with this minstrel past, moreover, the banjo still remains a tool of comedy. Steve Martin, for instance, his banjo playing led him to stand-up comedy and acting. The folk revival also directly inspired many contemporary uses. And in Eugene, Oregon, I would be remiss not to point out the adoption of the banjo by Jerry Garcia and Grateful Dead, some of these projects. His embrace of bluegrass and old-time music is highly relevant to this community. In fact, most old-time players today really come out of that lineage and not Appalachia. I had to include it. I played a gig last night. We opened for this band called Caltucky from California. And I met this dude. I'm like, can I take a picture of you and share this with the group? He was addressing the group by, hey, y'all. You know, he was using Southern. And, I mean, this guy he's a Rastafarian, but tearing it up on the banjo. The banjo isn't limited to these niche musical subcultures. Pop stars like Taylor Swift and others pick a banjo when they want to convey folksiness, sincerity, a connection to the past. And in recent years, the black origins of the banjo have been reclaimed by artists such as Rhiannon Giddens and the Carolina Chocolate Drops. In fact, just earlier this year, Beyonce embraced the sound of an old gourd banjo to make the case that country music is black American music. So we appear to have sort of come full circle here. This will be 30 seconds right now for a conclusion. So this instrument has passed through many hands in its 400-plus year history. What accounts for this flexibility and enduring popularity? I want to close with a few remarks about this. This is also generalizable to all the instruments I'm looking at in the project. First, the banjo's staying power resides in the way different players and communities have put it to work in different ways at different places in different times. It's kind of a mouthful right there. So simply put, the banjo is a shapeshifter. It survived and thrived because players have flexibly adapted and reinvented it to fit new circumstances. But to be clear, these new uses, applications, everything, don't mean that the old layers of meaning go away. There's a historical sedimentation of meaning. To play the banjo today is to invoke all the stages I just discussed. The Afro-Atlantic experience, minstrelsy, Appalachian front porch pickers, folk revivalists, and more. In other words, these meanings are additive. The web of associations can be extremely dense for an instrument because music matters and people have always sensed that an instrument's meaning is a whole lot bigger than just the sound it makes. Finally, the story of the banjo illustrates a common theme in the cultural biography of American instruments, and that's this productive tension between novelty and nostalgia, which I'll be really going deep on in this project. To blacks in the 17th and 18th century, it was a technology both for forging immediate coalition, and with that, the very notion of Africanness as an identity, and rooting that coalition in a shared past. To whites in the 19th century, it was an exciting novelty instrument that sounded out the vibrant modernity of Afro-Celtic exchange, while also referencing romanticized images of the Old South, what Dubois calls the plantation of the mind. A heavy whiff of the archaic also hung to Appalachian whites' adoption of the instrument, even though this group only got their hands on it in comparatively more recent times. In the context of the urban folk revival of the mid-20th century, the instrument's symbolism as something both very old and very American was, paradoxically, its powerful novelty, a way to unite younger Americans around a shared vision of the past and a possible model for the future. Thank you. We have 5 minutes only.
We have,
regrettably.
yes, we have 5 minutes before the end of the session, but we could,
And I can stick around as long as folks need, yeah.
We can probably take another 10, 15 minutes after if people wanted to, but maybe we'll start with people who haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, or?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you address the mummers?
No, but I should. Yeah. Can you say a couple words about that?
I'm from Philadelphia, and the mummers string bands are a big tradition in Philadelphia. New Year's Day, 13-hour-long parades. Men dressed in these elaborate feathered outfits, strumming banjos down Broad Street.
Do you know if the mummers tradition is related to the Pinkster celebrations?
I don't know.
Because in New York, and I think parts of Pennsylvania, in the 17th and 18th century, there was a very popular African-American tradition called the Pinkster celebration.
Oh, okay.
And this was a highly banjo-driven, string band-driven, wild multi-day celebration, which actually gives us our very first documented, in the United States, use of the word banjo. 1736, it was a white observer looking at a Pinkster celebration. And it may have been in Philly, or Connecticut, or New York City. It was like it was in the metroplex.
What's interesting, go ahead.
Oh, yes, we have some other questions. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about if you consider how it's taught in all these different points in time that you're pointing out, because it seemed, when I saw the sheet music,
Yes.
it was kind of striking. I don't ever really think of it as being taught for sheet music, and so is that like
I'm so glad you
written
asked
down?
that question. That this is a really important part of how the banjo is transmitted in the 19th century. From what we understand, all initial banjo learning was orally and orally transmitted. So in other words, the first actual books that attempt to put in writing this technique emerge in the 1850s, 1860s. Okay, this is part of the reason why we have to to some extent, believe some of the early minstrels, and this becomes a really problematic kind of historiographical question, because much of what we can know about these early practices are refracted through the lens of minstrelsy. It was Sweeney, as a child, learning, actually apprenticing with players on the farm. This was this really potent inversion of power, because now the slaves were the masters. Those were the people, that was the source. You have early minstrels saying, when they're passing through the South, you know, I'm going to hang out in these areas. I need to spend some time with the slaves so that I can learn the authentic way, the genuine way to play. Okay, but it was entirely through just watching and doing and working slowly with people. Part of the modernization craze in the latter portion of the century had to do with encoding this in written notation in a manner like a guitar or a piano, so that it can reach middle-class audiences who presumably were musically literate. Okay, this represented a profound shift in class connotations around the instrument, because most of minstrelsy in the early phase was associated strongly with lower-class whites. It was associated with white ethnics, like Irish folks. It was associated with African Americans. It was associated with places like the 5 Points slum in New York City, where there were a lot of grog houses and dance parlors that featured the banjo and minstrelsy. This was an effort to elevate it through the edifying technique of European notation. Today, in old time, it's entirely with the ear. I don't know anybody who has ever looked at a method. Like Pete Seeger wrote a great method book. But you know, he's breaking it down in a really simple, and he's trying to be as grounded as possible and not highfalutin about it. So thanks for mentioning that. I think Francis and then Vera.
Okay. So I'm curious, you sort of tied together in the conclusion where the banjo is now. I wonder if there's another sort of renaissance happening and how, like, what cultural meaning that's carrying. I'm thinking specifically of what Mumford & Sons did for the banjo in their sort of brief stint of popularity, and also just the success of the Roots Ensemble on campus here. It seems like there's a real interest in young people in, like, picking up these sort of analog instruments.
It does seem that way. Billy Strings has also been has proselytized for the banjo in a really effective way. In ways, I have to kind of view this as part of what scholars have called the never-ending folk revival. The folk revival never ended. I drew the line in 1960s here because maybe this was the moment of biggest ferment, but really we're still in the revival. And I think when oftentimes younger folks in Eugene, Oregon, now you go to some holler in Kentucky and it might be very different, but in Eugene, Oregon, I think there's a lot of folks, urban educated folks, coming to this instrument maybe because of its analog charm, because it does point to something simpler. Because, and this I think is absolutely the case for the instrument and the kinds of music that this instrument plays, this is about social interaction through music. This is about casual pickin' parties, sitting together and just playing. It doesn't matter how good you are. Right? So this is an instrument that kind of evades the cult of perfection that many musicians find themselves in. I'm not looking at you here. I mean, that's what I mean, like the folksiness and the charm, all of these meanings have sedimented, I think, into the way folks understand it. I think many players today understand its Africanness fundamentally. They also understand its southern whiteness, right? And negotiating that tension, there's a certain richness and complexity, a semiotic complexity to doing that, to standing up on a stage and playing this instrument in 2024. Yeah, Vera?
So fascinating. I do want to push you on the concept of sedimentation.
Please do.
So it seems to me that there might be some issues with thinking about sedimentation. One is that you mentioned the kind of the tournament of cultures, and of course Beyonce fighting this fight. And so there's more contestation around what the meaning of the banjo is, and maybe sedimentation would imply. Also, I feel like it does maybe reduces the agency of those cultural agents who continued a certain strand of meaning for the instrument over time so that it would
Completely.
be available in the future.
Right.
Because it suggests that whatever meaning has been applied to the banjo is going to stick there.
It's gonna stick there.
It's going to keep on going, rather than there were people who fought to keep these meanings alive, and that they
Completely.
were agents who invested energy to maintain it so that it would be available to a future generation. So
Mhm.
maybe it might be possible to think about reservoirs of meaning that have been established in various parts of our country that people can reach back to and draw on, and that can be in tension with one another rather than sedimentation. I mean, given how widespread it was, I'm willing to bet that there have been cultural meanings of the banjo that we have lost, you know?
Absolutely.
Especially because it predated the borders of the US.
Yeah.
So there were some that have probably gone extinct and that have not.
You are
continued on
absolutely
with
right.
the banjo.
This is why it's great to have a historian in the room to check me on things like that. I think reservoirs is a better way of thinking about it. I agree with you. Also, in the way that I've segmented things here, this is running roughshod over the idea that if black string band banjo playing has always been there. It's not like it stops. A lot of players left the banjo. A lot of players said, "Hey, the guitar. I'm gonna switch over to the guitar." But as late as the 1970s and 80s, when Cecilia Conway did a really great ethnographic project in the Appalachian with people in their 80s and 90s, players who were still playing clawhammer banjo in a very old way in the hills. So in other words, it's not like certain meanings die out entirely. They're always there. With the banjo, sometimes I think it's required some theoretical gymnastics to get one's mind around the fact that the bluegrass is a black music. Fundamentally, like without black music, you cannot have bluegrass music because the vast majority of players today are white. But this is part of the, I like this idea of reservoirs being available and efficacious for different people at different times. I might use that instead and credit you.
Well, since you focused on the banjo.
John, I'm so sorry. I wanted to ask one more question for you. I was just sort of building on Vera's question there. I was thinking about how you have your 4 S's at the beginning, and they were, let's say I wrote them down: stuff, self, sound, and symbol, right?
Got it. Wow.
And I was so intrigued by the tension between how you're talking about the interaction of the instrument and the self, and then your presentation brought up so many different kinds of groupings and ways
Yes.
that groups are forming. And in the music that you were playing, we were also hearing other instruments layered in, and so I was just dying to know, like, how are you thinking and talking about groups and the formation of groups? And I think it might it may connect a little bit with what Vera was talking
Absolutely. I think, in some ways, this is where these 4 categories all break down into the fabric of the social life of instruments. Okay, so how I might use this instrument to stand up in front of human beings and play it and be associated with this instrument as some kind of manifestation of self, but ultimately I'm placing myself within a particular set of social fields. Okay, and how I conceptualize myself as like this group, not like that group, is a major part of self-fashioning, right? Is how we kind of position ourselves within a broader, how we align ourselves socially. And I think, to me, this is what makes the banjo so fascinating, and all the instruments in my book have a very similar kind of groundedness in social processes and contestations of meaning. It's what is so alluring about this instrument that folks would want to use this to sonify some aspect of their personality, and how would they form a kind of coalition with others in doing that? Okay, this is a technique for navigating a social environment. So I think in many ways the self really is also kind of the social, and the symbolic is the social, the sound is the social. All of these are social constructs. The material disposition of an instrument is shaped by social forces. So I'm glad you brought that up, because you're right. I skirted the social at the end, but I think that's the overarching theme of the project.
Well, it was so resonated with your presentation. I was just interested in what
Absolutely.
Well, throughout your presentation, I was most fascinated by the two categories at the beginning and the end, up there in the conclusion, the flexibility and the tension. And I thought, what is it about the banjo which appealed to these African people? And I think it's a combination of the percussion. The percussion was their internet. That's the way they communicated over distance.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add this other element, the string effect. And when they first started to play this instrument, this claw hammer technique, it was basically a percussion type of approach.
It's highly percussive.
Yeah, highly percussive. And if we look at other instruments, you see the same tension. For example, the piano. Is it a percussion instrument or is it a string instrument?
Yes.
And you'll have whole groups or schools devoted to the percussive school of pianism and the string approach to playing the piano. And I think that's where the flexibility and the tension, it kind of melds together. And that, I think, is the basic attraction of this instrument. Of course, the problem with the piano is it's very difficult to carry around.
Portability issue is a big one for the piano in the 19th century. Yeah.
Yeah, so I can see that why this would be much more adaptable to many different sort of contexts and appeal to
Certainly.
different
Certainly, and
performers.
I mean, and you mentioned percussion and kind of the idea of a drum with strings. It should be noted that at least in colonial times, in 1740, this is when British landowners in the southern states with slaves outlawed drumming. Okay, this is officially, these groups cannot drum because that was a very dangerous form. Potentially, they viewed it as dangerous in terms of its ability to communicate over distance and to whip people into, there's all kinds of accounts of this could whip people into a frenzy. Essentially, they were worried about it. This moment places, in some ways, particular symbolic demands upon this instrument because this is doing the work of drums that can't be there. Okay? This history is really important. After the Louisiana Purchase, when we start to see the first accounts, say Latrobe's 1810, 1812 of Congo Square in New Orleans, we see evidence of a lot of percussion because the population of African Americans in the Deep South following the Louisiana Purchase was far higher than in Virginia and the Piedmont, certainly, and Tidewater. So there was a little bit more laxness going on in Louisiana. And so much of when we look at something like New Orleans and why it's been the epicenter of every musical revolution in this country, it is relevant that this is a moment when a bunch of Afro-Caribbean folks pour into the city, a bunch of folks after the Haitian Revolution, and there's relatively permissive attitudes regarding percussion instruments. White slave owners didn't see this instrument as a threat. They saw it as a benign, they're having fun. There's a very paternalistic, like, okay, we'll give them that. Meanwhile, these percussive energies moves into, in a very direct way, this is performing a lot of the percussive work of drums that aren't there.
Yeah, and that carries over all the way to Pete Seeger, because the establishment figures say, oh, well, he's just having fun, but he's delivering a message. And it's a very revolutionary message, a social message, but he gets by because he's having fun.
Because he's just picking a banjo.
Well, I have a question, but I also recognize we're out of time, and I'm spoiled. I get to talk to you all the time.
Do we
So
want to maybe
after-
adjourn and then we can talk? Or then,
Yeah,
if
sure.
anybody
I
can
also
stick
wanna-
around, we
I
can
also
continue
wanna-
conversation, but at the same time we don't.
Give others the opportunity.
Marvelous presentation.
Thank you.